Probably to nobody's surprise, I did some debate during high school. I participated in the Lincoln Douglas style of debate and went to some competitions during that time. Debate was something I was passionate about, or at least I was passionate about arguing and being right all the time, and this seemed to be a effective way to demonstrate those skills and to grow and things of that nature. Now, I remember my first competition very vividly. We were bused to another high school for the day, and how it worked is I would have four debates in that one day, four different chances to compete on the topic that was chosen for this particular year. And during these four times, I would get randomly assigned, which side I was. I had come prepared with either side of the debate. Well, the first two debates of the day did not go very well. I lost both of those debates. It's my first competition, remember, give me some grace, but I lost them, and so I was feeling like I needed a win. Well, the third debate of the day, the other person was a no-show. So I kind of technically won that by default, but not really. Finally, time for the last debate of the day. And I decided to pull out all the stops. And what that meant is I upped my energy, the volume of my voice, and I began to a little bit get into the character attack kind of strategy where I pointed out how this person was clearly hating on homeless people and wanted everybody to starve, and if we followed their plan, everything would turn out bad and be terrible. And I used a lot of that hyperbole and exaggeration and literally overwhelmed them where they couldn't respond. There was too much I said that they couldn't get to. And I won that debate. But I'm not exactly proud of the way I won. It wasn't about my arguments, my evidence, or really my strategy. It was that I was a bit louder, and I started to hyperbolize and exaggerate their kinds of views in a way that they couldn't quite attack, because I wasn't saying anything attack worthy, actually, with logic or reasoning or anything of that nature. Now, I won that debate, but I didn't win in the way that was right. And today on this episode, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about winning, and specifically winning as Christians. How do we do it? How should we win? What are the things that we need to be winning at? And I hope today to turn on its head a lot of ideas we have about Christians and winning. And I fear that a lot of these wins that we think we're doing on behalf of Jesus are not something that Jesus would actually be proud of. Not one bit. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is Christianity Without Compromise, a podcast for Christians who love Jesus but are tired of culture war faith. Now, let's get to rebuilding a faith that actually looks like Jesus. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about some of the kinds of standard wins that many Christians will strive to, right? Winning people to Christ, winning elections or legislation, winning debates, winning the culture wars. Those are the kinds of wins that I have to seriously take a look at, and I want us to all reconsider, because I'm not 100% sure those are the kinds of things we have to win in the first place. But this episode also is going to tackle another side of things, the how we get to those wins. Because even if we can agree on a win, on a result that is just objectively good, I have to really wonder about the ways we reach those, because too often we compromise our values, our virtues, our ethics to get those wins that might be universally agreed upon as good things. Maybe they're not universally agreed upon. But whatever the case, I'm worried about how we get there. Okay, so this episode, we're going to be exploring both those dimensions of winning, both questioning the results and questioning how we get there. And ultimately, what we want to do at the end of the day is ask ourselves, how does Jesus want us to win? Let's start with the scoreboard, the things that we measure as wins for Christians. I already mentioned some of them, like elections and legislations, or winning people to Christ, number of baptisms, or number of people raising their hand, or, number of people that showed up in the church sanctuary today. Those are the kind of metrics we often use to say, hey, yeah, this is a good thing. We've achieved a result that is admirable, that is, a good thing for all people involved, Christians or otherwise. Those are the kind of metrics we often use. But I'm really concerned about some of those specific things, and I'm also really concerned about how much we get caught up in the results and measure it by those certain means, by how many people sat in the pew today, as if that is a metric truly that we should be measuring in the first place. But when it comes to the scoreboard, one of my main worries is that a lot of that stuff we're just stealing from the rest of the culture. We're stealing it from how the business world measure things, or how politics measure things. We are stealing from the ways of the world and saying, this is the metric, this is the scoreboard, this is the results that we like, without doing the critical work of even asking, is that what it's all about? Is that truly what Christ would want us to measure and look at as the results? I am often thinking of the whole book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, but especially Corinthians chapter 1, that really reframes this entire conversation. Just one verse out of 1 Corinthians 1, in verse 27, Paul reminds us that God is turning upside down a lot of the things of the world, including what we consider wise and what we consider foolish, right? 1 Corinthians 1, verse 27 says, instead, God chose the things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. So we really have to stop and think, hold on, wait a second. Are there things that the world thinks are wise and powerful that God is just not on board with? Those are not the same kind of measurements and statistics and results that God is looking at? More often than not, God is just defining success differently. And it hardly is ever about numbers, about quantity, about efficiency. God's metrics are much more intimate, much more individual. It also brings to mind this really interesting scene where Jesus is tempted by the devil following his baptism. There's a lot to unpack there, but one of the things I want to note is the kinds of temptation that Jesus is offered. He's offered bread. He's offered a spectacle, this chance to kind of show everybody who he is and what he's all about. And then finally, the devil offers him the kingdoms of the world, influence, power. And Jesus refuses all of that, right? Jesus refuses the shortcuts. Because even though they might have seemed effective, they might have seemed like, good goals, like, wouldn't it be awesome if Jesus ruled the world? Wouldn't it be awesome if Jesus was up in front and visible of everybody? We could skip the whole 3-year ministry thing. Let's jump let's jump to bigger crowds and bigger audiences, book Jesus and better venues here. No, Jesus rejected all that. One, those weren't Jesus' goals at all. We see that throughout the Gospels. Every time Jesus has kind of this potential chance to make a bigger spectacle, to maybe take power, Jesus rejects that. When the swords are drawn, he's picking up people's ears and healing them. When he is in front of Pilate, there's this great ruler of the time, Jesus says very little. He's not persuasive. He's not getting Pilate on Team Jesus, and he's certainly not trying to take Pilate's position. Jesus' results, his goals are different. He doesn't take those shortcuts. The problem wasn't just that Satan was offering him these things. It was that those weren't really things that he actually needed. He was fine. He was good. He has a different way. Jesus has a different metric. Jesus never chose the most effective ways to reach the most people. Jesus was not one to care about the big numbers. Oh, yeah, some crowds came to him for sure, but it was never about getting the most people on the mountainside. He chose instead the most faithful way to reveal the heart of God, not through the successes and measurements that the world wants us to look at and care about. I suppose God could have done it all differently, but God didn't. That leads us to our next point here, is that even when we reach successes that might seemingly be good, although we have to first, look at critically, hey, wait, are those actually good metrics and goals to begin with? But let's, for the sake of argument, say, yeah, there's some objectively good goals. How we got there matters too. The means definitely matter. They shape things. We cannot escape that. Because if you'll indulge me for a while with the example of trying to teach a kid how to eat vegetables, okay? If you wanted to teach a kid how to eat vegetables, there's several ways you could do that. One, you could shove the vegetables in their mouth. That would get them to eat the vegetables, assuming they can chew and swallow and things. You could punish them for not eating the vegetables. You could educate them on the value of vegetables. You could, create some kind of reward system if they eat their vegetables. There's a lot of things you can do to get a kid to eat their vegetables. But whatever your method is, what you can probably realize, if you take 2 seconds to think about it, is different methods there will train them to feel a different kind of way about vegetables, even if the result is they eat their vegetables at the dinner table, okay? Because some of those methods, like if you're shoving the vegetables in their mouth, are probably going to teach them, hey, vegetables are bad, something you just have to stomach, they're not great. Later, when they're out of the house, they might choose to forego vegetables altogether. Same with some of the different kinds of punishment and systems around vegetables that could create this kind of weird culture that vegetables are a punishment, that they're a bad thing, not going to get them to actually like vegetables. Now, I'm not here today to tell you how to train your kid to eat vegetables. The point is, whatever method you use can often have unintended consequences, even if the result, the success, is the same. Like the kid eats some vegetables. We can accidentally get in some really nasty, dangerous territory if the how that we accomplish that goal is not thought out very clearly, and is certainly not done with any kind of Christian ethics in mind. And we kind of know this intrinsically. I think most of us Christians today are going to not like the crusader style of evangelism, right? Where we literally stick a sword to your throat and say, repent now, become a Christian, jump in the water, get baptized kind of thing. We all intrinsically know now, like, that is not a good thing. We look shamefully back on history. And if you disagree with this and you think Christians should convert people at sword point, I suppose comment below and we can have a talk and I'll be praying for you. But generally speaking, we know, okay, wait, there are some off-limit things, even if the goal is good. Like in this case, somebody becoming a Christian. Now, that leads us to a modern story, and that is the influence and example, the things that came about after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Because I saw so many people on the internet say the results of Charlie Kirk and his ministry when he was living and then after his assassination turned all these people to Jesus. Atheists were coming out of the woodwork saying, because of Charlie Kirk, I believe. I heard a preacher who I know personally talk about his niece coming to Christ, deciding to be baptized at church because of the influence of Charlie Kirk, especially after his assassination, that she was influenced by. Now, I'm a fan of people being Christians. I think it's a really good way to live. But I have some qualms here with people, with influencers like Charlie Kirk, because it's not just the results that matter, it's how we get there and the kind of worldview we're being discipled into. Because Charlie Kirk, there's no way around it, is a bit of a divisive figure. The things he says are often not at all Christ-like. The way he treats people who are differently than him, maybe not in his actual interactions, which more or less, he was halfway decent at, but in the way he talks about people of other races or different positions or sexualities is not at all Christ-like. Charlie Kirk's vision of Christ was tied to power and politics. It was argumentative, very intellectual, and taught you to have to be right. And that debate was even the kind of things that Christians should be doing on a regular basis. It was demeaning. It was not something that truly reflected Jesus. So that is why I get a little concerned with the how. Though I rejoice when people come to Christ, no matter the means, I'm fearful of what kind of disciple of Christ they are becoming when the means of that was not something very Christ-like and very Christ-honoring, even when the result is something we all kind of like. This is all over the Bible. For instance, we have this situation where God tells Moses to speak to this rock so water can come out of it. This is going to give some water to the people of God in the desert who need that water to live and to survive and thrive. Well, Moses decides to hit the rock twice. Now the water comes out. The people get their water. The results are the same. But God's not a fan of how Moses did that. This story taking place in Numbers 20 results in Moses not being able to go to the promised land because he didn't obey God. Even though the results were the same, the how mattered. We also see this pop up all throughout the Old Testament, especially where Israel is called to a different way of nation building. The whole Old Testament, honestly, could be a document on how not to be an average nation, because Israel was constantly told to do things that were just not at all like their neighbors, not even close. Sometimes they would do the same kind of things their neighbors did. They would capture a city, for instance, but they would never do it like in the normal way. They would be marching around walls and blowing trumpets or something. And many, many, many times throughout Scripture, Israel is told, don't be obsessed with horses and chariots. Don't go after the horses and the chariots. And that is a common refrain because that's what the big nations in the area did. That was their military might. That was the tanks of the ancient world, horses and chariots. And Israel was told, don't gather large amounts of horses and chariots. They were handicapped, in a sense, from the traditional nation-building project because they were never called to do the traditional thing. Even when some of the results were the same, capturing cities and such, all the things that happened to get this promised land, the way they did about it was so radically different. They were called to a different way. It was never, ever, well, as long as you get the results. God has from the beginning cared about the how we achieve that. And it's more than just in evangelism. It's anything like the way we get certain policies passed, the way we do good in the world. The way always matters, no matter what that end of the line success looks like. And ultimately, if the way we act like Christ and proclaim Christ looks nothing like Christ, then I don't think we've actually won in the end, even if it looks good at the end of the line. I want to make one final point before we wrap up this episode, and that's a reminder about what Jesus does care about. I've already talked about how we have to question some of the metrics of the world, some of the ways we define winning, and then I've talked about how we need to question how we get to these wins, how we get to these results. But now let's proactively talk about, well, what's the replacement to all this? What does Jesus want us to do? And Jesus wants us to choose the method that most reflects what he is all about. Jesus is in the business of changing people. And every action, the how, the means, as well as whatever results end up from that, need to reflect what Christ has done in your life. And it ultimately all stems from the way Jesus comes into the world and approaches everything. Because remember, the thing Jesus did, God's whole plan for the universe, for salvation, for the church, for everlasting life, all that fun stuff happened through a pretty, let's be honest, weird plan. The cross was a strange way to go about getting these results. But the cross was a message. Philippians 2 describes how Jesus' whole project was humbling himself as a servant, coming down, giving up power, and even humbled himself to death on a cross. Why? Because the whole process mattered. It was supposed to teach us something. God wasn't just, Googling, how do people die these days in Roman times? I guess the cross. We'll just kind of do that one. No, everything that Jesus did in his life and ministry was on purpose, for the purpose of teaching us how we should live our lives. And, if it comes to it, the kind of things we need to sacrifice to end our lives. Jesus goes to the cross because that tells us how to live. Jesus is more than just sermons and, cool stories. Jesus also embodies the message through the suffering, through the patience, through faithfulness. Everything Jesus chooses to do is an example for us. Remember those bracelets? What would Jesus do? Well, that's a pretty good message. And ultimately, Jesus shows us that one of the things Jesus does is not choose the traditional means, the fastest, most efficient route, the things that would be easy and get the most attention. No, Jesus doesn't choose that on purpose, because that's not the goal. That's not winning. Jesus wins differently, and we win differently ourselves. Stanley Hauerwas, the theologian, he writes in his book, Community of Character, Christians insist on service which may appear ineffective to the world, for the service that Christians are called upon to provide does not have as its aim to make the world better, but to demonstrate that Jesus has made possible a new world. And that's something we need to wrestle with, right? As Christians, our job is to not steamroll over anybody and everybody in order to make the world the best possible version of itself. We have to think critically about the goals as well as the means. What that quote shows is that the Christian way of doing the world is just radically different. The way we go about the world might seem ineffective, it might seem weird and strange, and the kinds of results that we're after are just fundamentally different than the goals the rest of the world is after. We don't need power and privilege. We don't need to pack a room with people that slap the label Christian on themselves. But when it comes to Monday and they're at their work, they're at school, they're at their daily life, they're doing whatever, they don't act like Christ. Our goal is not so short-sighted. It's not so much about the big fancy metrics and the numbers and the things that look cool and tell great stories. No. The goal of the Christian life is to live such a transformative, intimate, counterculture life that people start to realize that there is a different way to do things, and it's ultimately a better way to live. The results might not look like, picket fences and the American dream or whatever. The results are ultimately better. Because the methods we use today are ultimately training us to be a certain kind of Christian tomorrow. And they're demonstrating to the whole wide world exactly what Christian values ultimately are. Now, in conclusion, I feel like I need to have like 75 different caveats here. Number one, I'm not anti-evangelism. I'm not even anti-numbers. I'm not anti-growth. Like, those kinds of metrics can be good. Like, I truly would love to fill a whole room with passionate Christians that are loving God and wanting to be formed by the character of Christ. Huge fan of that. I do want that. But that in itself is not the goal. That is a nice little perk, a nice little thing to have, but filling the room is not the goal. Winning the laws in our favor is not the goal. Changing society so that Christians aren't, the lowest rung or whatever is not the goal. Those things can be nice, and in fact, they can often do really good things for the world. Those are nice things to have, and sometimes they can be byproducts of us Christians truly living a life where we just win differently. We need to get our priorities straight, because the goal of Christianity was never to achieve the kind of things that many Christian pundits are telling us that's what we got to achieve. No. Christianity is about forming people who look like Jesus. That means the means and the ends both matter. The way we do things and the things we accomplish, they matter. We have to take a hard look at it if they actually reflect Christ. So I want to close today not with more answers or more of describing kind of this way of thinking. I want to ask us some questions. What have I called a win that Jesus might call a loss? What have I justified because it worked nicely, whether or not it was, a really great thing to do? And ultimately, who am I becoming by the way I pursue what I say I believe? Friends, it's always a good time to crack open the Sermon on the Mount, look at Romans 12, things of that nature, and learn what is Jesus wanting me to become? What kind of life does this look like? Because we're going to learn real quickly when we spend some time with Jesus that the blessed people are not the successful ones accomplishing all the things, not even the ones transforming the entire fabric of culture. No. The blessed ones are the meek, the humble, the poor. Christ has an upside-down kingdom. It's wild, it's weird, but I love it. Ultimately, it is best for everybody involved to throw off some of the metrics of the world and to understand, hey, Christians live differently. I want to offer another quote from Stanley Hauerwas, the theologian I mentioned earlier, because this is a good reminder for us when the way we do things doesn't seem like it's going to get all the results that we like so much. And this is a good quote to remind us that even if we don't hit all the metrics the world says we need to hit, that we're still doing the right thing. Hauerwas says in his book, Community of Character, virtue as its own reward is a reminder that we choose to be virtuous because it's the only condition under which we would desire to survive. That is my reminder for us today, that we might be virtuous no matter what, that we might be virtuous no matter what the world is trying to tell us, even when there are certain celebrities influencing Christians who don't themselves have a very solid Christian great worldview, even when there are laws passed or laws taken away that seem to help us Christians out, even when all the church pews are filled to the brim and it seems like everybody is there to worship God and we can pack the space, whatever the results, I hope today we can remember our ultimate goal is to be virtuous, to be Christ-like. Those are not the kinds of wins that we need to strive after. Christians win differently. And this is my invitation to that different way of life. This episode of Christianity Without Compromise was hosted by me, Jake Doberenz, and produced by Theophany Media, my podcast production company. If this conversation served you, please rate and review the show and share it with a friend and help others find it. You can also subscribe at jakedoberenz.substack.com to get email updates with new episodes every Tuesday and my often humorous theological reflections on Fridays. And as always, don't just listen, live it. Live out that Christianity without compromise. Thanks for listening.